Okay, so what happens to Latin America after they gain their independence? Um, where do they go? Well, what initially happens for Latin America is Latin America is an export economy, usually of things like coffee, uh, raw materials, food products, particularly agricultural products. Argentina will export cattle, Brazil will export beef as well. So they're going to be export products, and as such, they're not always the most successful. But in the late 1800s, they go through a resurgence, an economic resurgence. So let's talk about that. It's based on the philosophy of positivism. Positivism is believes that with observation and science, we can make changes. Essentially, they believe that we can manage things scientifically, that through research, through rational thinking, we can solve economic, social, and governmental problems. If you look down here at the cartoon I got down here in the corner, this is an example of positivism. Let me just sort of move that over a little bit. We'll see if maybe you can see it. It shows the man walking along the road. He's on his way to the wise man up the mountain in the cave, and he says to the wise man, "How does a person find true happiness?" And the wise man said, "How would I know? I haven't read the research yet." That's positivism. That is the idea that if with research and with good thinking we can solve almost any problem. Number two, there's a second industrial revolution that made manufacturing more efficient in the late 1800s, and some of that manufacturing begins to appear here in Latin America. Populations have doubled, so there are a lot more people to feed, but also a lot more workers. And as people made more money through industrialization, people accepted liberal reforms. So this new industrialization leads to an increase in wealth. And along with the increase in wealth comes more social safety net programs for places. Okay? So, what else is going on in Latin America? Well, we move up north. We're going to move north of South America. We're going to move to Mexico. Instability and foreign intervention. So what happened during the reign of Santa Anna in the mid-1800s, in the mid-19th century? First of all, the Northern Territory of Texas decided it wanted its independence, gained it, and then was annexed by the U.S. Also, at the same time, the U.S. has this idea of manifest destiny. You're going to learn a lot about that next year with Mr. Glossner in AP U.S. history. But manifest destiny is this idea that the United States should rule from the Atlantic to the Pacific. We should rule the entire North American continent. Standing in the way? Mexico. So we go to war with Mexico, and the Mexican-American War ended with what I called an unfair treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. Really, it wasn't very fair for the war itself, but what's the U.S. get out of it? U.S. gets about half of Mexico's lands, all the way through California. Mexico loses great economic potential, and this will lead to a mistrust of the United States by much of Latin America. They see how we treated Mexico, and they're going to start to distrust us. And then once they see how we treat Panama in the early 1900s, they're really going to distrust us. One of the guys who fights back against the U.S. is, or really in Mexico, is Benito Juarez. He's an intellectual who pushes for a secular nation. Mexico is very heavily influenced at this point, its government is, by the Roman Catholic Church, and he wants to lead to a separation of church and state. Okay, next up I've got a little map here. Shows the United States along with when states joined, and you see that we've got all this ceded by Mexico in 1848. That's at the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. Really everything south of the red line was at one point claimed by Mexico as part of its nation. Now you look at that, that's a huge part of the United States. California, Nevada, Utah, Arizona, New Mexico, Texas, even up into Oregon, parts of Oregon and Idaho. So it's a pretty large expanse. All right, let's look at other nations. Now Argentina. Argentina is sort of unique. Argentina was not really dominated by either Portugal or Spain. I'm sorry. Let me back up and say that again. It was not really dominated by either Portugal or Spain through most of the colonial period. and as such is a little more independent, and you're going to see a lot more diverse than some of the other parts of Latin America. What export products does Argentina have? Argentina, and still today, it's known for its beef and its agricultural products, beef, hides, wool. Um, they implement a number of reforms to help out people, they're poor and they're less fortunate within their country. So that's the story of Argentina. Argentina again will come back because Argentina is going to see a large number of European immigrants. You're going to remember this right here at the southern tip of, not tip, but yeah, right down here at the Cape Horn of South America. So you're going to remember that. Argentina is going to come back. How about the Brazilian Empire? Okay, we're looking at pretty much what's out here in green, not all of it, but what's out here in green. And what was the Brazilian transition to independence like? They're a transition because it's done by the king's son. Remember, Dom Pedro? The transition to nationhood is relatively smooth. They keep slavery, they keep their large landholders, and they become an export economy. The main export product for them is coffee. Coffee. In fact, Brazil will be the last, hear that, the last South American nation to free its slaves. It will wait until 1888 to free its slaves. It's very, very traditional. Very traditional. And that's partially because, remember, the king takes over Brazil. Okay? Up next. Cultural expression after independence. Describe the evolution of Latin American country. Initially, then begin the beginning, they borrow heavily from the neoclassical traditions of Europe, especially the elite. What in the world does that mean? Neo meaning new, classical. So what that means is they take over, not take over, let me choose different words. They take and copy much of the traditional classical, traditional European culture, European music, European literature, European ways of doing things. The next generation after independence, they turn to Romanticism and national indigenous cultures. They start to see in the late 1800s, you start to see a rise in the pride of Latin American nations, of their Latin American heritage, culture, and eventually even indigenous people, meaning Amerindians, Native Americans. They start to take pride in that. There's a growing sense of that. Politicians begin writing histories of their own nations, not of Europeans anymore, but histories of their own countries. And with the new Industrial Revolution in the late 1800s, new writers dealt with corruption, prejudice, and greed. So we're starting to see a real broadening, and what we come to think of as a uniquely Latin American country. This is not, please do not misunderstand me. Latin American culture had always been unique, but we see them starting to take greater pride in that rather than try to copy what they had witnessed in Europe. Okay? Popular dance, art, folk music differed from the elite. In other words, the elite are frequently trying to copy the latest trends from Europe. Meanwhile, the native people and the poor people are trying very desperately to be, not desperately, I don't know if that's right. I'm having trouble with my words right now, aren't I? They're trying to be unique, different, and taking great pride in what has been traditionally Latin American and Native American. All right, we'll stop, come back, and do part 4.